Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I am Prashant and in today's episode we'll be taking a look at the Land Day protests in Palestine, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka and the nature of the Rightwing project in India. Our first story is from Palestine where Land Day was marked on March 30th. The day marks the murder of 6 Palestinians by Israel in 1976 when they were protesting the expropriation of land. The demand for the right to return for all those who were expelled from their lands in the 1948 Nakba and their descendants is one of the key demands of this annual protest. These protests are especially significant at a time when there is a constant assault on the land and property rights of Palestinians. Now, this is happening in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. We have with us Abdul to talk more about this.
There were different protests in different parts of occupied Palestine, and those protests, particularly the biggest one in Gaza, they raised the issues of right to return primarily. The refugees should have the right to go back to their homes. As we all know, in 1948, millions of refugees, Palestinian refugees, are displaced and living different parts of the world. So they want the right to go back to their ancestral land and so on. So that is one major demand. Apart from that, the other slogans which were raised were related to the current attempts by the Israeli state to basically grab land, which is ongoing in different parts of the occupied territories and in the 1948 quote-unquote Israel also. So the protesters or the demonstrators also basically talked about their steadfastness against the occupation, the kind of oppressions they are facing. And so it is, you can say, it's a collective set of issues which were raised by the protesters in different demonstrations. One of the demonstrations which were held in the place where in 1976 the Israeli government was trying to grab the land. There they also basically talked about some of the speakers talked about the current attempts by some Arab states to normalize their relationship with Israel and so on and so forth. So you can see the range of the issues which are raised are the typical Palestinian issues, the issues of the Palestinian movement, which basically is the struggle against occupation and larger Arab unity. The unity, when by the way, one last thing, which is very important, is that the Land Day protests also mark a kind of collective Arab Palestinian understanding. So Palestinians living in the Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territories, they basically also raise the slogans of unity and collective struggle against the Israeli occupation.
It's interesting because Israel and the United States are trying to create another kind of Arab unity with the recent conference we were talking about as well.
The kind of attempts made by US and Israel in last few, you can say 1 year and so, is basically to kind of break the Arab unity on Palestine and create a kind of a closeness between Israel and some of the Arab countries who are ready to kind of, as Palestinians say, betray the Palestinian cause. So in that particular context, Land Day creates a kind of resistance to all such ideas. Yeah, it marks that resistance. Yeah.
Right, Abdul. So, as you said, there is a line of events that connects what happens in 1948, that's with the Nakba, refugees in large numbers being forced to leave their lands, to 1976, to the Great March of Return in 2018, and even now, where we see a very intensified assault on the lands and the belongings of Palestinians. And this really seems to have increased over the years, is happening in Sheikh Jarrah, in occupied East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Negev, all over the historic Palestine. So could you take us a bit through what are the current forms of assault on Palestinian land that is taking place?
Yeah, particularly in last few years, the land grab, though the settlements have been there for last at least 40, 50 years, and they are expanding. So that we know that how Israel is basically occupying more and more land in the occupied Palestinian territories through expanding their illegal settlements. In the name of security, building the barrier, apartheid walls, and so on and so forth. So that kind of land grab has been there, and it is continuing. So that is one set of one way through which Israel is basically grabbing the Palestinian land, and which is well known. But apart from that, there are other ways through which Israel has basically attempted to take more and more land. One, which you rightly mentioned, the issue of Negev, for example. There are a large number of Palestinians, the Bedouins or whatever you call it, they live in the Negev, and Israel is basically trying to displace them while calling that particular movement afforestation, that they're planting trees, removing people living there for generations in the name of environment and taking green belt and so on and so forth. The ultimate objective is to build a large settlement there as well. Then there are other ways through which land grab is happening. For example, agricultural land in the Jordan Valley has been expropriated by Israel in the name of agriculture, in the name of security, in the name of preserving the water bodies, and so on and so forth. So these are different ways through which Israel basically, the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, for example, in Eastern Jerusalem, is also an example through which basically the refugees who were forced out from their homes in 1948 were settled in some of the places in Eastern Jerusalem and other occupied territories. Now the Israelis forcing them to kind of forcing a displacement, a second displacement on them now. So Sheikh Jarrah, for example, saying that these lands belong to the Jewish before the British occupation and so on and so forth, and therefore taking a legal recourse to kind of quote the sham legal recourse to displace Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah. So the thousands of Palestinians have been displaced in that way also, particularly in Eastern Jerusalem. And then illegal constructions like wall in Gaza. They have built a wall in Gaza. They have built a wall in the West Bank and surrounding areas. So these are different ways through which Israel is basically displaces Palestinians, forces them to live in ghettos, forces them to live in a clustered regions, and takes away more and more Palestinian land. So Land Day basically symbolizes a struggle against all these attempts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Abdul, for talking to us and explaining what's been happening not only currently but over the past few decades as well. We now move to Sri Lanka, where the economic crisis seems to be worsening by the day almost. Hours-long power cuts, long queues at fuel stations, shortages of food and medicines. There seems to be no end to the woes of ordinary Sri Lankans. There is a long history of this crisis stemming from the 70s to the pandemic to the disastrous ban on chemical fertilizers that was imposed by the government last year. Earlier, I spoke to Ahilan Kadirgamar, a senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna, about some of the dimensions of this crisis. Could you maybe first tell our viewers what is the, underlying structural element that has led to all this? There is talk, of course, of the fact that there is a foreign exchange crisis, but what really is leading to this?
Yes, I mean, while it's reflected in the day-to-day problems that have emerged, and some people, including the government, claim that this is a problem that emerged with the pandemic and the lockdowns and the disruption of the economy. Others are saying this is due to, with the change of government 2.5 years ago and the emergence of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he immediately cut taxes. So our state revenues have fallen by almost a third. So they claim that is the cause of this crisis. Others trace it back to the Easter attacks in April 2019, when the tourism sector first got disrupted. But I see this as a much more longer, drawn-out crisis in the making. I would go back to 1977, 1978, when Sri Lanka was the first country in South and Southeast Asia to liberalize its economy. So there are very particular characteristics that have played out into the political economy of Sri Lanka. But this particular crisis has been in the making, I would argue, for a number of decades. But it was disrupted in a major way by the civil war, the long civil war of 26 years. It is after the end of the war in 2009 when actually Sri Lanka went into another IMF agreement. Sri Lanka has gone through 16 IMF agreements in its post-colonial history. A significant one was, of course, structural adjustment in 1977-78, when we liberalized the economy. In 2009, again, we went into an IMF agreement, and we got the kind of positive report card from the IMF to be able to go borrow extensively in the global capital markets. There was huge amount of capital that came into Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka was not only seen as a post-war economy, there was also a trend of, after the global financial crisis of 2008, funds flowing into what were called the emerging markets. So Sri Lanka was seen as an emerging market and a post-conflict economy. So our stock market in those 18 months after the war quadrupled. So you can imagine the euphoria. It was one of the best performing stock markets. There was a lot of investment in real estate. Colombo changed over the next few years after the war. So a lot of investment in infrastructure and real estate. And we actually showed very high levels of growth, on the order of over 8% growth in GDP in those first few years after the war. But this was a sort of a bubble that was created by speculative finance coming in. And when that started to peter out, there's been another conflict that has been created by the Rajapaksa government at that time. That's when they started to unleash attacks on the Muslim community. So it was no longer the Tamil minority, but now the Muslim minority has been created as the enemy. But there were also economic pressures that led to large amounts of trade union struggles and so on, which is what led to the fall of the Rajapaksa government in 2015. And that change was significant because at the end of the war, many actors felt that the Rajapaksas were here for decades. But as I mentioned, Sri Lanka has a long history of democracy, and that led to the regime change. Again, even with the new government, in 2016, as the economy continued to collapse, despite the goodwill of various actors, India, the West, and so on, they had to go for another IMF agreement. And through this IMF agreement in 2016, again, we went and borrowed in the capital markets, sovereign bonds, where 40% of our external debt is sovereign bonds. So this accumulated debt, a form of debt trap, I would say, is what has culminated in this crisis. Of course, the disruption that came with the Easter attacks, the tax cuts, and the pandemic have sort of pushed us over the cliff. But this has been a long crisis in the making. And it's important to recognize that, because getting out of this crisis is also going to be long and arduous. And I don't think either in Sri Lanka or international analysts are recognizing the depth of this crisis and what it would now take to get out of it, which would mean really completely shifting the direction of our economy.
And finally, recently India witnessed state elections in 5 states, including Uttar Pradesh, which is the country's most populous state. The right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party, which is in power at the centre, won or emerged as a leading force in 4 of these 5 states and formed the governments. In the aftermath, there's been a lot of discussion about the kind of project the right-wing led by the BJP is executing. I earlier spoke to NewsClick's Pragya Singh on the nature of this project. What exactly is this right-wing project that we are seeing that's happening in India? You mentioned some of the aspects, which is that one, it is to create a very unified Hindu identity, which covers up some of the social and economic divisions. And one way of doing that is by creating an enemy, which is most often the Muslim. So that's one key part of it, of course. But how would you see some of the other manifestations that of this project that are taking place? And I think it's also important to talk about here, because we know that the BJP is not just a political party. It is in some ways the political associate of a larger movement, that is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or the RSS, which has a much older history. And as we know, the RSS has an education wing. It has wings in every aspect of life, and its members in the political wing are the Bharatiya Janata Party, and Narendra Modi is also a member of the RSS, and they have a much wider project for India than just political dominance. So, so for the benefit of our audience, could you also take us through, what is this project?
Yeah, Prashant, from every decision that the government has taken before and after this election, it's very evident that they are steamrolling ahead with the Hinduta, what we call the Hinduta project, which means to create their own version of a majoritarian state, which is based on religion. The principal idea is that the primary community that can claim Indianness is the Hindus. And this is built on the basis of insecurity vis-a-vis the minorities, be it Muslims or Christians or whoever. So, with this project in mind, the BJP has been stepping up its action in certain spheres. The primary one is the legal sphere, where they earlier talked about exclusion, they are now enforcing it through laws that limit whom people can marry, through laws which say what you can eat or not eat, and also through laws which limit trade and commerce based on what religion you belong to. These three things are extremely dangerous for Indian society, but the even more worrying aspect is that there is no way to challenge it right now until the BJP retains its dominance.
As long as, So in a sense, but you're also saying that these are not direct laws per se as much as laws which actually have that impact, I guess, right? Because directly the law does not say don't eat this, don't eat that, but it sets the stage whereby it happens.
Well, actually, yes. Nobody will make a law, don't eat this, because with India's history, you want to maintain a veneer of democracy. You want to maintain the facade that, well, people want this. And so you first launch a social movement which is violent and aggressive, and then you ensure that a law is passed as if people had demanded it. So that's basically, yes, what goes on. But the second level is that we've also seen that the BJP is very interested in a certain kind of development. I would say that they want a vision, they have a vision of a modern state which is filled with amenities and infrastructure, but whose people are impoverished. And they also raise expectations of people, which is fine in its own way, but they do not give them the means to fulfill that. This builds its own resentments, and the result is that there is more conflict. So that is another risk of having a party which is not challenged by an opposition, which is not challenged socially. And I do think that those forces are lying untapped. Now, the other thing, like I said, is that there are dominant landed communities or numerically dominant communities, which have tried to regain some of their lost power by voting for the BJP.
Caste communities as well.
Caste communities, yes. So, these communities have a different vision of India than, these communities vote for a party which has a different vision of India than the other regional parties.
Right.
The most important thing actually that's going on is that there is a corporate-led development that is taking place, which means that you are told that the corporate is a job creator and that you can aspire to either work in a corporate or become a job creator. And but you have not provided people the means, the education, the healthcare, the schooling to really fulfill any of these aspirations. Instead of that, a small number of corporates get the contracts to provide you what the government was anyway supposed to provide you. So the farm laws were a great example of that, where the government's job is to transport food grain from one place to the other so that people have food to eat, and then provide it to people at a subsidized rate. But they want the corporate to go from village to village and buy this grain at the price they want. Now, so far people have really resisted these kind of ideas. They have seen them for what they are. And I think in India you cannot really have a, with the 2016 demonetization, that's exactly what they tried to do, where the small scale sector, the smallest companies are the biggest employers, but they directly attacked that sphere of business. So I think the BJP comes to power with these agenda in their mind, but they create their own the forces that would oppose them also arise instantly. I've always said that this is a party which has come to power with a opposition from day one.
A latent opposition. I mean, or a
Yes.
potential opposition.
That's right, a latent potential, but yes, those social forces exist. It is just that someone has to tap into them.
Absolutely. And that's all we have time for today. We'll be back tomorrow with more daily debrief. Until then, keep reading and watching People's Dispatch and follow us on all social media platforms.